Steve Vogel is a veteran journalist who reported for the Washington Post for more than 2 decades, writing frequently about the military. He covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, as well as military operations in Iraq, Somalia, Rwanda, and the Balkans. His previous books include Through the Perilous Fight, about the War of 1812 in the Chesapeake, and the story behind the Star-Spangled Banner, and The Pentagon, a history of the building from its creation in World War II through the 9/11 attack. Steve, you're up.
Thanks so much. Yeah, a real honor to be here at this spot to give a talk with an audience like this. I had a chance to look over the museum a bit earlier, and what a fantastic collection of artifacts in a very historic site. And some of the work that went on there actually touches on a couple of topics that I'll be speaking about related to the Berlin Tunnel. The other reason I'm honored to be here is this is the first time I've given a talk at a brewery. This is already ranking as one of my favorite talks of all time. I haven't even tried to hear yet. So.
Okay, absolutely.
So how did I get into the story? Somebody was asking me about that earlier. And I do have a few connections to the tunnel. One of them is that I was actually born in Berlin. My father was stationed with the CIA starting in 1957 in Berlin as an undercover case officer. And I was born 3 years later in 1960, so after the tunnel, but before the wall. And my dad always used to say it was no coincidence they put up the wall soon after I was born. Didn't take it personally, but kind of wondered about that. After we left Berlin in '62 for other postings, I had some return trips to Berlin. One as a German language student after high school, we took a bike trip through Europe and into Germany. We went through Checkpoint Charlie, so got to experience that part of the Berlin Wall. And then I was back again in 1989 as a reporter. I had been working here in Northern Virginia for the journal papers, and then I decided to try my luck freelancing overseas, and also to go to Oktoberfest. That's a different part of the story. But I was doing coverage for Army Times in the fall of 1989, and one night, of course, we get the news that the Berlin Wall is coming down, and so I'd only planned on staying in Germany for a couple of months, thought I'd be home by Christmas. I ended up staying for 5 years, covering all the developments that accompanied that momentous event, including the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the unification of Germany, espionage trial of Marcus Wolf, the East German spy master, plus a lot of the military operations that followed in the wake of the Cold War's end. The Gulf War and Somalia, Rwanda, Balkans. But I continued being interested in Berlin as a Cold War subject. My dad had actually died a long time ago in 1986, so he was still with the agency at the time, and I never had a chance to talk to him about it. Some of his closest friends who were still friends of our family, I'd hear some stories late at night, maybe over their second scotch or something. And my curiosity was definitely piqued about some of the stories I heard about the Cold War Berlin, back in the day before the wall went up. And a couple of those friends had died in recent years, and I actually wrote an obituary of Gus Hathaway, who was a well-known CIA officer and a great friend of my dad's. That was in 2013, and I just decided at that point, because so many of his colleagues from those days were passing away, that this was the time. If I wanted to do anything, write anything about Berlin and the Cold War, this would be the time. So I got to work on it around that time. I wanted to give some context. By the way, I did not pose for that silhouette. I think they got that from Mad Magazine, but I wanted to give some context for, let's see if I'm pointing this wrong way. Yes, I am. I'm sorry? It's HarperCollins imprint called Custom House. Let's see. There. Okay, got it. Okay, this is some context that probably a lot of people in this audience are familiar with, but I'll go over it anyway. This book more or less focuses on the 1950s, and the early 1950s is when the book begins. And the setting at this time is the early days of the Cold War. The U.S. had emerged from World War II as the sole superpower. Of course, we'd had Manhattan Project secrets stolen. The Soviets had managed to explode their own atomic bomb in 1949. In addition, they maintained a huge Red Army presence in Eastern Europe, including East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland. Much larger conventional force than the Western forces on the other side. And our intelligence operations, which during World War II, we'd actually had a pretty decent window into Soviet communications. We were intercepting a lot of their communications and deciphering them through the Venona operation, which the Army Security Agency ran very successfully. But unfortunately, in 1948, the Soviets, after being tipped by a spy in the ASA, and also Kim Philby likely as well, they changed their codes and they stopped using a UHF radio nearly as much. So basically, it was known as Black Friday. Everything went quiet almost overnight. So in many respects, we were blind at this point because we didn't have, across the way you could see some of the history of the U-2. The U-2 was not flying yet at this point. Satellites were not overhead at this point. So we were missing all kinds of things. We'd missed the start of the Korean War, the North Korean invasion. We missed the scale of the Chinese intervention. We'd misjudged the capabilities of the North Korean army. So we were paying a pretty heavy price. And Dwight Eisenhower, who'd come to power as president after the 1952 election, and Winston Churchill, who was back in power in London for another term as prime minister, were both deeply concerned about the lack of intelligence they were getting. I should mention as an aside, at this time, U.S. presidents actually did value good intelligence. A little joke of mine. But so Eisenhower, in fact, was very, very desperate to get better information. He was actually, I looked through some of his diary entries out at Abilene, Kansas, where his library is. And he was actually envisioning a scenario where he was going to have to launch his own nuclear strike, preemptive nuclear strike against the Soviets, because he didn't have any really good reading on the Red Army's capabilities or intentions or what was going on in the Kremlin. So he wanted better intelligence. Oh, I think we missed one. Yeah. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go to this slide and then I'll move back. So here are a couple of key people that were involved at this time. Bill Harvey on the right, he would become the Berlin base station chief. He was actually my dad's boss. He was there a long time. And quite a character, as some people in this room will definitely know. He was, apart from being this product of almost the opposite of the Eastern establishment image that we have of CIA officers in those days, the blue blood. They went to the Ivy League schools. He was a guy from Indiana. He'd been an FBI G-man, and he'd actually been quite effective at breaking up some of the Nazi spy rings during the war. And he had been actually one of the first people to head up a counterintelligence team in the United States that was directed towards the Soviets, because it quickly became apparent that we were going to need that capability. So he had developed a real expertise about the Soviets. He, among his other idiosyncrasies, he drank like a fish. He would have, I don't know if he drank much beer, but I think he would have been okay with having a talk here in the brewery. He certainly drank a lot of martinis, and he also packed a heavy array of weapons on both on his person and in his office. He would sometimes, just sight his gun on whoever was sitting across from him, which kind of made people nervous. But he'd actually more or less, he'd had a falling out with J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI and had left when he was reassigned to Indianapolis. He left basically, the reason that Harvey was mad was, the reason that Hoover was angry at him was, one, Harvey would often do things on his own without getting approval from higher ups. And the other thing was, he was at an FBI going away party one night, had a little bit too much to drink, stopped his car during a rainstorm in Rock Creek Park, and slept for about 10 hours, and he was missing, reported missing, so that cost him some points with Hoover. Harvey, after leaving the FBI, was quickly hired by the CIA, which was just in its first stages at this point. And they were desperate for someone with Harvey's skills, because Harvey knew more about Soviet intelligence at this point in 1948 than anyone else. And Harvey would soon work with Frank Rowlett, who is another guy that has some big connections to a place like this, because it was Frank Rowlett was one of the legendary code breakers from World War II, and he had headed up the team that broke into the purple codes, the Japanese diplomatic codes that we intercepted, and Vint Hill was, of course, very much involved with that operation. So he had had a falling out with the first director of the NSA, and he too left the NSA and came to the CIA. And these two guys, very different personalities. Rowlett was this courtly, genteel Virginian. Harvey was this, complete runaway train. But they saw eye to eye on this, and they were working together to figure out a way to break into Soviet landline communications, since they weren't using the radios to speak of. So now I'm going to go to this slide. So 1950s Berlin. This is a map that we put together for the book. It shows the context that again, many of you know, of Berlin being in the middle of East Germany, and obviously separated from the West. It was basically an island in the middle of East Germany, divided into 4 sectors. But it's always important to remember that at this time, even though there were sector boundaries, there was no wall. So there was free flow across the sector boundaries, and you had 10,000 people a day going back and forth to jobs on one side or the other, to visit relatives, to go buy produce from the farms in the east. You also had a lot of people flood. Even at, say, 1953, about 300,000 people who were trying to leave the east. Berlin was the one place where they could still get out at that point. So thousands of people, 1,000, practically every day coming across and seeking refuge in the west. So it was, in this atmosphere environment, it was really relatively easy for the West to pick up intelligence about the East. They could meet with these refugees and recruit people. They might have information, who might have had jobs, sensitive jobs in the West, who had relatives, in the East. And there was also, at this point, a huge population of intelligence operatives in Berlin. By some estimates, 10,000. You had various officers for lots of different countries, not just the US and Soviet Union. You also had various charlatans, who were operating paper mills trying to sell information. Goons, agents who'd been recruited. So it was quite an atmosphere. It was, one CIA officer described it as kind of a mix between Casablanca and Dodge City. Or kidnappings that were going on. KGB, Stasi would kidnap people in the West and bring them back east. So also, of course, a city that's still recovering from the war, particularly on the eastern side where there really hadn't been much reconstruction. The West was starting to really blossom again, and the nightlife was back in Berlin. And that is a photo of my dad's Mercedes that we had for forever. But sadly, he later sold it for 25 bucks, and I've never forgotten that. Okay, now we'll go to the next one. Hopefully. Yep. Here we go. Sorry about that. You can see I wouldn't have the technical skills to work in ASA or anywhere else. So pretty soon, Rowlett and Harvey were focused on the possibility of a tunnel in Berlin. And one of the guys, the main reason they got on this idea is the British had done this in Vienna. And Peter Lund, who was sent to Berlin as the station chief, had been in charge. He'd been the mastermind of the operation in Vienna. And the Brits, because Vienna was also a divided city, had been able to target Soviet communication lines in Vienna and had actually been able to get quite a bit of good information. But the British were interested in trying to do this in Berlin as well. And the reason why Berlin was the focal point for this attempt was that apart from being the espionage hub, Berlin was really the communications hub of Eastern Europe. You had the old imperial communications, the telephone and telegraph wires. Everything came in like spoke to the hub of Berlin. So just like, all roads led to Rome, all the communications led to Berlin. So it held out the possibility of being a place where the CIA and British Secret Intelligence Service could tap into Soviet communications, hopefully on a very large scale. And Peter Lund, very different personality again from Bill Harvey. He was very mild-mannered and soft-spoken. He was actually also a champion skier. He'd been captain of the British ski team at the Garmisch Olympics in 1936. That's him in the middle there. But again, he and Harvey were able to come to an agreement to work together on a tunnel operation. And the idea was that the Americans would provide the manpower to dig the tunnel and the money to dig it. The Brits were in pretty poor shape financially after World War II, and they didn't have the type of budget that the CIA had. So it seemed to be a marriage made in heaven. But one problem is that it brings George Blake into the picture. And George Blake at this point, 1953, when both Harvey and Lund are settling on Berlin as the focal point for this operation, George Blake had already had a storybook life. His father had actually fought for the British Army. He was from Constantinople originally, his family, but he had ended up fighting for the British Army in World War I, become a British citizen. He had gone to Holland with the British Army at the end of the war, met a Dutch woman, married. Their child was George, named after King George. A nice idyllic life for a little while, but then the father died and the family was bankrupt. So George Blake was sent to go live with wealthy relatives of his father who lived in Egypt. This was a wealthy family. They had a large palazzo in the middle of the Nile, and Blake went to various schools there, British finishing schools, that sort of thing, for expats. And he was back in Holland at the outbreak of World War II when the Nazis invaded and bombed Rotterdam. He survived that bombing with his grandmother. His mother had managed to be evacuated to England along with his sisters, but he was left behind and ends up working for the Dutch resistance as a schoolboy courier. He's about 14 years old. He's pedaling around Holland, and then he decides he needs to escape because he's half Jewish and a British citizen. Escape, he fears arrest by the Nazis, makes his way through Europe, crosses the Pyrenees in a snowstorm, and makes his way to Spain. Is held in one of Franco's prisons for a few months, and then is released and returns to England, joins the Royal Navy, but he's pretty quickly recruited by Secret Intelligence Service because of his language skills and his underground skills. And He ends up serving in Holland, and then after the war in Germany, and then he's sent to Korea in 1949 to be the station chief. And he's there when the North Koreans invade in 1950. He's taken prisoner along with other British diplomats, and he's held with a number of American GIs and others. They're subjected to terrible conditions, particularly in those first months, a death march where we lost about 400 out of the American 700 GIs who were on that death march. Blake survives, the conditions improve, and at some point, and this is of course an important point, he makes the decision while he's in captivity, 3 years there, to switch sides. And I'm not going to go into the whole story about that, just because it's very interesting. And there's lots of different speculation that we can put to it. But he essentially becomes an ideological spy, and when he returns to England to a hero's welcome in 1953 from Korea, he's soon assigned by SIS to a very sensitive job called Section Y, where he becomes one of maybe 3 people in British intelligence who are aware about this top secret plan to dig a tunnel in Berlin. So, meanwhile, the Americans and the British have been moving ahead with this project, and on the right is Hugh Montgomery. We're really fortunate today to have Hugh's daughter, Maria, here in the audience. So glad that you could come here. Hugh was an incredible CIA legend. He only stepped down from the agency a few years ago after a 50-plus year career. He served in the OSS. Actually, he jumped into Normandy with the 82nd Airborne, was wounded in the Normandy breakout, and he spoke 8 languages. So he was just a phenomenal linguist. And it wasn't too long before the OSS learned about his skills. And by the time he was out of the hospital, he was in the OSS. He ends up serving various missions behind enemy lines, where he meets his future wife, who in Austria, and goes back later to bring her home as his wife. He is sent to Berlin in 1952, and it wasn't long before Bill Harvey recognized that Hugh Montgomery was somebody he could really rely on. He was described at an OSS banquet a few years ago as a Harvard PhD who could hold his own in a bar fight. So he's certainly a Harvard PhD, and he was involved in some very big operations over the years. But the tunnel was really the first one, and he became the right-hand man for Bill Harvey on this. He was also, one of his jobs on the tunnel was to help recruit people in the East German Ministry of Telecommunications who had information about the cables, the telephone cables that the Soviets were using. So along with Alan Conway, who's on the left there, who was a former ASA guy who was working now for the CIA, who oversaw the communications side of the operation, Montgomery and others were able to recruit some 20-plus agents who worked different capacities at the telecommunications ministry, and they were able to provide the CIA with circuit diagrams, maps, showing where the cables ran, the trunk cables carrying the communications that would be the most useful were. And so they had a gold mine of information after a few months. And this map kind of shows where this is going on. So the portion of Berlin that is identified on the basis of these maps as having the most potential is way down in the southern part of Berlin, right on the sector boundary between the American sector and the Soviet sector, near the East German village of Altklinika, which is part of Berlin, but it's really like a rural farm village almost at this time. And across the American sector is Ruda, which is on the western side, and the Army, working in cooperation with the CIA, leases some land down there where they can build an army installation quite close to the boundary. So the idea is if they put an army installation there, they can use that as a cover to dig a tunnel that could reach these cables, which are underneath one of the principal highways in Berlin. It's actually a little more than a country road, but it carried a lot of military traffic on its way to the airfield at Schönefeld. And the Americans, working with the Brits, decided that this location would be the best. It was basically farmland here. There was a cemetery here that they had to skirt around and miss because they thought that would be a bad idea to dig under a cemetery. But this was about a quarter mile that they're going to have to dig, which was going to have to be hand dug because they couldn't make noise and alert the East Germans and Soviets that something was going on. And the other thing they came up with was they were trying to figure out, well, what to do with a quarter mile of soil that you dig out of a tunnel is going to have to go somewhere. And if they had a bunch of trucks just driving off with dirt, it wouldn't take the Soviets too long to figure out what was going on. So they decided, well, we'll just store all the dirt in the warehouse, and that will be the perfect place, and we don't have to truck it anywhere. And so that is what they came up with. They also decided to, as an excuse more or less for operating so close to the Soviet sector, they decided to put antenna on the roof to monitor the nearby Soviet airfield at Schönefeld. And this was a very legitimate operation. The idea was they decided to make it a real electronic intercept station so that it would look real to the Soviets. And so they brought in Army signal soldiers to run the station. These soldiers have no idea that the operation is also really a tunnel, because it's a very compartmentalized operation. And this photo overhead on the right shows the route that they're going to have to dig, a quarter mile there, through the farm field, past the cemetery, to the highway here, which you can see it's a pretty rural setting where they're going to do all this. So to do the digging, the CIA didn't have the manpower expertise to do that. So they brought in a top secret clearance team of Corps of Engineers guys. The two Army officers on the right, on both sides, Keith Comstock on the right and Bob Williamson on the left, were each in charge of a team of enlisted men who would actually do the construction. These guys were brought into the Pentagon in the spring of 1954 and told they were going to have to dig a tunnel. It was going to be have to be done in secret without making any noise. They weren't told where or why, but it was going to involve going into denied territory, and that was it was kind of a jaw-dropping moment, as Keith Comstock, who the guy on the right, described it to me. But they pulled together this team from various Army installations on the East Coast. They train out in Sandia in New Mexico in sandy soil, somewhat similar to what they would encounter in Berlin. And meantime, the CIA has contracted out all this steel liner that they're going to have to use to line the tunnel with, this quarter-mile long tunnel, because the soil there was so sandy that they're going to have to keep it from collapsing. And they trained with this equipment out in New Mexico, and then they had to ship it back east to Fort Lee in Virginia, and then load it onto a ship sailing to Bremerhaven. And then they would put it on one of the military duty trains that the Western Allies still had access to Berlin on a daily military train, among other ways. And so Keith Comstock on the right was given like the fake papers identifying all this material that has to go through East Germany, through Soviet checkpoints. And he was like convinced that he's going to end up in the Gulag, but they managed to make it all the way there. And he's not, they get there with the equipment in August of 1954. they arrived at the warehouse, everything set up, and in September of '54, they begin the actual digging. So the construction continues for 6 months. You had, this is a 6-foot diameter tunnel, and they're working with little entrenching tools because there's not much clearance here to dig. So you'd have somebody holding a sandbag, somebody digging, and 3 6-man teams working around the clock, 24 hours a day. And they're constructing a rail line as they move forward with wooden tracks and electric forklift to carry the soil back to the warehouse and then bring out these huge steel liners, 6-foot sections of liner that they have to put into place, and then they have a hydraulic system to kind of push forward with a shield as they dig forward. Basically digging about I think it worked out to 11 feet a day, something like that. After 6 months, and meantime they're being watched from the east. The Vopos, as the East German border police were known, were constantly watching. It always amused the GIs who were watching from an observation post inside the warehouse that the Vopos were always looking up at the roof of the building and never below their feet where this tunnel was being dug. Farmer Nowak, who owned the farm there, I spoke to his daughter, and she recalled that he would sometimes hear these strange whining noises that he assumed were coming from the warehouse somehow. But what had happened was, the engineers had run into water at a much higher level than they'd anticipated. So they had to use water pumps to keep the dig dry. And then they also ran into a septic field from the warehouse, which was really unfortunate. Hugh Montgomery had some interesting tales about that. He was a wonderful source of his tales from the whole operation. But after 6 months, they've got a completed tunnel, quarter-mile. Keith Comstock, the Army Corps of Engineers captain, figures that they're directly below the highway. They can hear the trucks and stuff going overhead, and they believe the cables are directly below their stopping point. And meantime, right below that highway, they have to build a equipment chamber because in order to tap the Soviet communication lines and do it in a way that the tap isn't detected, they were going to have to amplify these signals on an enormous scale. And so they had just below the highway, it looked like the command center on a battleship, just this row of sparkling clean amplifiers and all this equipment that was kept in a dust-free environment, very unlike the tunnel digging had been. So at this point, the Corps of Engineers, the U.S. engineers are sent home, and the British are brought in to do the tap. On the right, you can see the 3 cables which are targeted. These are 3 trunk cables that the diagrams that the CIA had managed to acquire showed were carrying all the traffic, all the most important communications traffic, except for the highest sensitivity ones, which were carried on overhead wires. Everything else was on these trunk cables that connected the Red Army headquarters in Wunsdorf to installations across East Germany and beyond into S1, Eastern Germany or Eastern Europe, and then also back to Moscow. The GRU, Soviet military intelligence, is also using these cables. And the KGB, even though they primarily are using these high security overhead lines for the communications back to Moscow, they still get phone calls from the GRU and other installations around East Germany, so that a lot of their traffic is on these lines too. That's Peter Montignon in the middle. He was one of the SIS officers who was down there when the British tapping team, these specialists who had done the work in Vienna, they had been with Monty's, with the 8th Army all the way from Normandy to Berlin. These guys were some of the best telephone specialists around, and they were able to make the tap in such a with so little current being drawn off that they were able to do it without being detected. And this more or less shows what they've got here as they're finishing the operation. You have on this side is the warehouse over here, and then over here are the cables. This pop-up here shows the equipment chamber, the tap cables, which are 27 inches below the ground. So when the British team that's tapping the lines is working, trying to put the taps on, Peter Montignon, the gentleman I mentioned in the previous slide, was convinced at any moment a Russian tank was going to go overhead and the whole lot was going to collapse on them. It was a very loud and unpleasant environment, but he called it good Boy Scout stuff. They're able to place the tap. A T-junction cable runs back to the equipment chamber where all the communications are amplified, and then they're sent back to the warehouse, where in a secret part of the warehouse where nobody except for the team has access, they've got 150 Ampex recorders set up in a big, it's like a room the size of this brewery probably, just imagine 150 big Ampex recorders lined up, practically spinning all the time as the communications are coming in. So these are the guys who are working back in the warehouse. That's one of the recorders there. The night that they placed the tap, this was May of 1955, Bill Romey, one of the guys I interviewed, just describes having the headphones on and they're just waiting to see if they're going to get anything. They're not sure if the whole operation is going to blow up in their face. And he hears a Russian voice come on the line. It's a Russian Red Army colonel, and there was quiet celebration at that point. But then there was almost soon followed by almost despair, because the amount of communications that are coming in, pretty soon you have all 150 of these recorders are spinning almost around the clock. There's some quiet times, but generally they're capturing 1,000+ conversations a day, and these range from lowly logistical clerks to the highest command of the Soviet forces in Germany. And the guy on the left, Eugene Craig, he was actually at the Army Language School in Monterey. He was the lead soloist in the Army Language Russian choir. And all of a sudden, he's living the life. He gets orders one day to basically report to Berlin. And after being flown on a mail plane into Berlin, he's taken out to the warehouse site. They put headphones on his head and they tell him to get to work. And it's quite a culture shock for him. But they were just desperate because they were capturing so much material that far more than they'd anticipated. As Hugh Montgomery had said, nobody could have anticipated the volume of material that they were capturing, and certainly not the CIA or SIS.
Hey, Steve, quick question.
Yes.
How are they getting the information back?
Okay, right here, I'm going to talk about that. It's a great question, but they had a team at the Berlin, at the warehouse there, about 6 or 8 translators who are listening more or less live or close to live. They're looking for anything actionable, anything that, any indication. The primary thing, of course, is any indication that there's going to be a Soviet attack, because that was the big fear, a surprise attack that the Soviets would decide to do because of the American nuclear superiority. And so they're preparing reports on that, but most of the stuff that's being recorded, all these huge tapes, which weigh a ton, by the way. Hugh Montgomery had been one of the guys that would lug them out every night, put them in the trunk of a car. They would meet up in the Grunewald somewhere in Berlin, some out-of-the-way spot, and transfer the tapes to this other car, and then they would be taken to the Berlin base, the operations base, and flown out to Washington. The teletype tapes went to Washington, And then the voice tapes were taken out to Gatow, the British air base, and flown to London. So you had flights going almost every day. The British, sorry. There you go. The British material, the voice tapes are being taken to Chester Terrace in downtown London, very elegant facility there, where once again they were completely overwhelmed with the amount of material they're getting. And they'd had a few dozen translators and analysts and transcribers on standby waiting for the material to start coming, but almost immediately they're overwhelmed and they have to bring in more linguists. You know, they were actually, you know, bringing back some British Army colonels retired from the Boer War who spoke Russian, you know, and it was just an industrial scale operation. So they're transcribing the tapes and translating them, and then different groups of analysts are looking at them for different types of intelligence, and reports are being made based on this intelligence. So the Brits have this nice facility. The Americans, of course, they're using one of the temporary buildings down by on the mall that existed left over from World War I, World War II. These decrepit old buildings that used to be down there. And there's one called T32 right near the Lincoln Memorial that the CIA had, and it was known as the hosiery mill because there were just so many cables and lines running around. And they kept on having to put more safes in to store these tapes on the second floor that the floor started to sag. They were like worried the whole thing was going to collapse. And I talked to one of the women who was working there as a translator, and you know, the place just reeked because everybody was smoking and they couldn't open the windows because they were worried that you know, the Russians might pick up the electronic signals or other, you know, they're very worried about that. So they had all these wires and stuff trying to shield any signals coming out of the building. So it was a chaotic operation. Now, none of these translators or analysts knew where this intelligence was coming from, per se. All they knew is that they were translating stuff. They didn't know about a tunnel. And this is going on for close to a year. And among the conversations being taped are those of Marshal Grechko, who's the commander of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, you know, big hero of World War II. He's in charge of, you know, he would be basically leading an attack on the West if it ever happened. He's not informed. He doesn't know that his lines are being tapped. Even the KGB chief in Karlshorst, Petovranov, is in the dark. Then, after 11 months, in April of 1956, the tunnel was discovered, and it was a huge production. There had been rainstorms for a few days, and there had been short circuits, and the Soviets had a team go out, and they soon stumbled on the tunnel. Of course, there's a little bit more to that story that we can talk about maybe in Q&A period. But the Soviets, in April of 1956, when the tunnel is uncovered and the cables are spotted there in the ground, they bring every reporter in Berlin out to this site. This becomes actually the biggest espionage story of the day until the U-2 plane is shot down a few years later. And you know, the Soviets are hoping to make a big propaganda coup at this by embarrassing the Americans, by proving that the Americans are using Berlin as nothing more than a nest for espionage, and that you know, that they're not really protecting the Berliners. They're just violating East German sovereign territory, and are nothing but a bunch of bank robbers, tunnel robbers, and all kinds of names like that. So that becomes the Soviet story of the tunnel. This is the British cover of the book, by the way. I kind of like that one. It's got George Blake on it. Of course, I mentioned George Blake has known about the tunnel since before it was even dug, and he had actually passed on a warning to his handler in London before any construction begins, that the Americans and SIS are planning this. And his handler, Sergei Kondrashov, he gets us on a double-decker bus, and he feels like there's a hole being burned in his chest as he's looking through this material. He, of course, notifies Moscow Central and Ivan Serov, the head of the KGB, and the decision is made almost immediately that nothing is going to be done. Serov keeps the information to a group of two of his deputies in Moscow, because George Blake has positioned himself in such a valuable place in SIS that the KGB's decision is that A, they might not succeed in digging the tunnel, B, it's the Red Army's communications that are going to be intercepted. It's tough luck for them, and the GRU. It's sort of a classic tale that we hear, echo to this day. Not just the Russians either. You might find some familiarity here in the United States. But George Blake, who I spoke to, who's still alive, by the way, having been discovered in 1961, sentenced to the longest prison sentence in British history, escapes from prison in 1966. That's all in the book, too. Makes his way to Berlin and then on to Moscow, where he lives in a dacha outside of the city now. He says that the Soviets made the decision to protect him, and we can go into the whole question of disinformation and all that as well. But I want to leave time for questions and so forth. So I'll just break off here. And again, thank you everybody for coming. And I have books for sale, by the way. If anybody wants them, I'm happy to say. If you have books already, I'm happy to sign those too. So again, please feel free to ask me any questions you like.
Folks, this is all on film, so I would request that you wait for the microphone before you ask a question. I'll just keep an eye out for hands up.
How deep was the tunnel?
Well, originally they wanted to go about 30 feet deep, and they thought that would give enough cover, protect from like sound being heard at the surface, and also protect against the soil settling on top of the tunnel. And they've done a little geological analysis, but of course they couldn't do a site survey, doing core samples or anything like that. So much to their chagrin, when the Corps of Engineers, broke ground in September of '54. They'd gone down about 8 feet, and all of a sudden, they're running into water. They didn't expect it for another 20 feet. And what happened was that there was a perched water table. So there was some clay underneath that was holding up water, surface water. And so this was it was a huge consternation. They actually had to, stop for weeks as the engineers were going over it and trying to figure out what to do. And they thought about trying to tunnel beneath the clay, but that was going to be an engineering nightmare. And they just decided they would have to dig it much closer to the surface than they anticipated. So it ended up being about 8 to 10 feet below the surface, which wasn't much cover at all. That would lead to some problems. But they had some grout that they were, putting up through the steel liner to keep the soil from settling. And they just, they had the guys in the observation post who had a switch they could flick. If the farmer came overhead or any traffic, they would flip the switch. Red lights would come on in the tunnel, and everybody would freeze. So they kept things quiet. But one of the problems was, and this is described in the book, when there was a snowstorm, the first snowstorm of the year, after the tunnel was operating, they had air conditioning in the tunnel, but the amount of heat that all these vacuum tubes and all this are generating in the equipment room, it radiates down the tunnel. And the first snowstorm, the guys in the OP were watching. All of a sudden, as the dawn breaks, they realized there is no snow on the entire route of the tunnel. It's like, it looks like a neon light, an arrow pointing like tunnel, right at the warehouse. And people were, running around. And, Eddie Kindle, who was the site communications manager, they immediately started working on putting a beefed up air conditioning system, a chilled water system, so that they could get better refrigeration down the tunnel line. But fortunately, enough snow fell that day that nobody noticed, so they survived that.
Did George Blake and Kim Philby work in cooperation? Did they know, or they were both compartmentalized?
They didn't know each other at the time. Now, what happened was Kim Philby had actually been more or less identified as a spy by Bill Harvey. That was one of the things, Bill Harvey had a nose for a spy, and it was Bill Harvey who writes this memo in 1951, making the case that Philby is a Soviet spy, and Philby, who was the liaison for the British in Washington at the time, is taken back to London. So he's never really effective as a spy again. So Blake isn't really working as a spy at this point. He's still in Korea. So they didn't know each other at the time. However, one of those, fate takes mysterious turns. They both end up in Moscow together in exile, essentially. And, they became somewhat buds. They were they had very different personalities. Blake was very mild-mannered and kind of cautious, and Philby was pretty brash and full of talk. And they ended up having a big falling out over photographs that it's like a long story. But essentially, they knew each other well in Moscow, but not as spies. And Philby, of course, is part of the Cambridge spy ring, and Blake was not part of that Cambridge ring, although he did go to Cambridge later for Russian language training.
Last question is, did Angleton work for Harvey or the other way around?
Well, Angleton and Harvey were both, Harvey was in charge of one office, so they didn't work for each other per se. I mean, they were kind of friendly or not so friendly rivals. There's, by some accounts, they hated each other, but by other things I've seen, they actually had a pretty healthy respect for each other. So when Harvey goes off to Berlin to be station chief, it's during that time that Angleton becomes the counterintelligence boss. And, I think there was a healthy respect for each of them, each had for the other. And actually, I found in some of the files that there's a CIA officer named Bay Stockton did a book about Bill Harvey, and his files are out at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And there are actually letters in there that Angleton wrote to C.G. Harvey, Bill's Harvey, when Bill Harvey dies, talking about, his respect for him and how much they liked each other. And she says the same thing back to him. So it seems like they did like each other, even though there have been some accounts that presented as a big hated rivalry type thing.
So can you talk about, you mentioned Vienna and you mentioned obviously for your book, but did the Russians have any equivalent tunnels that have been found, or is there any indication of that, or did the East Germans, from the perspective of what they would obviously be trying to obtain for information?
Right, well, Sergei Kondrashov, who was Blake's handler for a lot of this, he later wrote, along with Dave Murphy, who was another CIA officer who my dad worked for, and he was Harvey's deputy in Berlin. Kondrashov makes the comment that one of the reasons the KGB was willing to let the tunnel go on was they wanted to see what the technological capabilities were of the CIA, and he says that it gave us some good ideas for operations that we could do on our own. And so there was a tunnel that was dug in the I think the 70s or 80s into the underneath the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. That could have had some taken its inspiration from this one. And then of course the FBI was digging a tunnel into the Soviet embassy in Washington. And that was blown by Robert Hansen, the FBI trader. And there have been other tunnels for sure. I didn't attempt to catalog them. I'm sure there have been tunnels that I haven't heard of and other people haven't heard of. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we learned that one day.
Follow-up question. You mentioned that the British came in to do the tapping. Just curious if there's any color you can add to that in regards to what qualifications or what was necessary to have that experience to do that.
Well, the guys that did it, they were actually part of the General Post Office in London. There was a special post office bureau that essentially worked with British intelligence, and they had they worked on a lot of tapping and various bugging operations through Eastern Europe. The three guys that were really the specialized workers who worked on these taps. I mean, they had to, essentially each one of these trunk cables, I give like a good description of this in the book. Each one of these trunk cables had like 100 circuits on it, these core wire, dual wire type connections, and they had to strip off the lead sheeting off of each one individually and gingerly pull up the wire, no more than like a millimeter, so that they could then connect it to their T-junction wire, and they had to maintain current, the same amount of current, so there was no current being lost from the Soviet lines and none being put into the Soviet communications. So it was a very intricate operation. I mean, it took hours and hours each time. They did each of the trunk cables on different dates. They didn't try to do them all on one night, but they waited until the middle of the night when they didn't figure there'd be as much traffic and less chance that that any sort of voltage irregularities would be noticed. Yeah.
Anybody else? Any more questions?
Thank you. So did the KGB stop their transmissions or provide disinformation when they found out?
They couldn't, basically, is what it boils down to. So over the course of the 1 year, excuse me, that the tunnel was operating, there were about 400,000 conversations or telecommunications, teletype communications that were intercepted. So that's over 1,000 a day. So if they had started, of course, it was impossible to make that all disinformation, because the whole idea of not doing anything to stop the tunnel was to avoid exposing Blake. So if they start bringing people in, on each side of the communications to put in bad information, each time you do that, you're increasing the circle of people who know about this. And the CIA actually had the East German ministry so well wired with agents that they probably would have learned about that pretty quickly. So, speculation that they could have just used a handful of the conversations, put disinformation on a small percentage of the calls. But the problem is that information would have been disproved by the 99% of the calls that weren't disinformation. So that would have raised red flags as well. And I talked to Blake about that, and Hugh Montgomery actually. They both said the same thing. It would have immediately raised a red flag that the operation had been compromised. So different investigations that were done after Blake was discovered in 1961 by the CIA, SIS, none of them have ever found one piece of bad information. They went over all the analysis, and to this date, and this is something that Richard Helms said years ago before he died, that there hadn't been any information that had emerged that was disinformation to that date, and I think since as well.
Was Montgomery involved in a decade later in the Vladivostok operation with the submarine cable? Say it's identical.
I don't think so. By that point, he would have been in Rome. 'cause he was actually the deputy under Bill Harvey in Rome in the mid-60s. He was involved in the Penkovsky case. He was involved in a lot of cases, but his specialty wasn't really communications. It was more like he was the right guy for Bill Harvey to, this guy who could help. He's a language whiz, and he could, he's very discreet. So this operation was being hidden from every officer at the Berlin base except for maybe 3, 4. So Hugh Montgomery. They had another communications officer out at the site who nobody at the Berlin base even knew existed. Bill Harvey's deputy, Dave Murphy, didn't really know about the operation until later. He was sort of gradually brought in on pieces of it. And people like Ted Shackley, who was one of the satellite branch chiefs in Berlin at that time, knew nothing of the tunnel. So it was so close hold. So yeah, I don't think Hugh Montgomery was involved in that, but he was involved in a lot of amazing.
Was the rainstorm excuse for digging up the tunnel an excuse? Was it a cover story for the Soviets to end?
They were waiting
penetration?
for something like that because, for a long time, there's kind of this bureaucratic inertia that set in, I think. Some of this is speculation, but this is what Kondrashov says as well. And basically, Blake, ironically, had been transferred to Berlin just as the tunnel was about to start operating. So, ironically, in Berlin, he was not in the same position to know anything about the tunnel because he was no longer with Section Y, so he no longer had a need to know about the tunnel. So if he'd start asking questions of Peter Lund, his boss, hey, how's the tunnel doing? That would have raised red flags. So Blake says he gradually saw enough indications that he was confident the tunnel was operating, but he didn't have direct knowledge of that. So the KGB doesn't really have direct knowledge of how much information is being lost. They're mostly assuming it at this point, and they try to give some warnings to the Red Army. They do these oblique things where they actually gave a report to Bulganin, who was then defense minister, basically saying that, look, the British were actually able to get a lot of information from Vienna because of poor telephone security. So maybe you should make sure that you're exercising good telephone security. And it didn't really do any good. So it was more this gradual, by the end of 1955, after the tunnel had been operating for 6 months plus, they were realizing that we've got to do something to stop this. And they created this special Red Army unit that Grechko was finally informed about what was going on. And then they put together this unit, and it took a while to get them trained so that they could be sent out. The unit has no idea that they're looking for a tunnel, but they have to wait for the right moment. And this was an operation that was approved by Khrushchev. So it's a pretty complicated operation, but they pulled it off.
Pretty exciting operation, expensive.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that 400,000 pieces. But what about in these 400,000 pieces, were there some things uncovered that had particular intelligence value?
Yeah, mostly a lot of it was
Trace this or that.
right. A lot of it was basically building order of battle about the Red Army, just getting basic information about their capabilities. They learned where a lot of units were based. They also found out quite a bit about the Soviet nuclear program because the East German mine in Vismut is where the Soviets were getting their uranium. So a lot of those calls were being intercepted by the tunnel. From a political standpoint, some of the interesting things they get is the dynamic of the leadership in the Kremlin after Stalin's death. So you had Khrushchev and Bulganin were in this dual leadership role at the time, and the first indications of Khrushchev's secret speech, where he denounced Stalin's war crimes and so on and so forth, that actually comes from some telephone intercepts from the tunnel, where Grechko Marshal Grechko was there. His wife had come to Moscow with him. She was a big blabbermouth. You know, she calls back to Berlin to tell her daughter, like, oh, you sure? Where she mentions that there was quite a development at the party congress. And it's not just her, though. I mean, there's a lot of different intercepts that they're getting from different people in Moscow calling back to Berlin. So they end up picking up a lot of political information, and things that indicate Khrushchev is the guy who's really in charge. I think maybe the biggest thing they got was what Eisenhower was looking for, was basically, he was worried that there could be a sudden Soviet attack, and they didn't find any indications of that. Quite the contrary. And ironically, within a few weeks of the tunnel being discovered and ending its operation, the U-2 starts flying. So almost immediately, we start getting this overhead surveillance. It's a different type of intelligence for sure, but it still provides, you know, good visibility into, you know, military movements and that sort. So it was kind of, that hole was plugged in a sense.
By way of review, the tunnel was up, running and operating from when to when?
From, let's see, from May 11th of 1955 till April 20th of 1956, so about 11 months. But then it took another 2 years to process all the calls that they... Yeah, the 50s, and then the U-2 is flying by June of 56, the first flight from Wiesbaden over East Germany into Soviet Union, so yeah, 55, 56.
I want to elaborate on that question. From the perspective of the original design, what was the expectation of the mission timeline? Obviously, you had mentioned about the tap. At the tap, it failed. It could have been found at that point. At the time of when it was discovered, how long beyond that would it have continued beyond? You mentioned the U-2, but would that have been successful until they replaced equipment or anything? You talk about Black Friday and other things that are obviously variables that come into play. They could have found something else and replaced everything across the board. Any thoughts on that? Saying before we start digging, we want to get what we can get in the next 6 months or the next year, or soon, you know, even if we get it for 5 weeks, that's enough to justify the amount of expense and timeline that was required to dig that out. If there's any thoughts on that.
Yeah, you know, there was a realization that, you know, the tunnel wasn't going to last forever. You know, an operation on that scale was going to be found out one way or another. Nonetheless, you know, Harvey, of course, was apoplectic when it was discovered, and ordered a big investigation. I think, you know, in retrospect, they thought getting a year was pretty good, or close to a year. I think if, you know, there are a lot of ifs here. You know, if George Blake didn't exist, and the Soviets would have had to find it on their own, I think it could have gone on for a couple of years anyway. You know, it's they had pulled it off. They succeeded in tapping those lines without alerting any of the East German ministry technicians or the Soviets who were monitoring those lines. So they didn't know anything about it. And the only reason they ended up knowing is because of the warning from Blake. The KGB, working with the Red Army Command, is eventually able to, you know, use a rainstorm to discover it. So I think it could have gone on easily for a couple of years otherwise.
Mr. Vogel,
Excuse me. So you mentioned just a couple minutes ago that the main reason, the primary reason why the Soviets allowed this to go on as long as they did, because they did not want to compromise George Blake. And my corollary question to you then is, in your opinion, from the Soviet point of view, do you think, remember he was allowed, I guess he stayed in operation for another 5 years, if I recall, to 61, and he was arrested finally. So do you think they got their money's worth for allowing the intelligence that they allowed to flow through before the tunnel was discovered?
I'd say they did, yeah. Because Blake, I think, was really one of the most damaging spies of the Cold War. I mean, he did enormous damage apart from the tunnel. When he goes to Berlin, I mean, he also pretty much blew the Vienna tunnel operation. But when he goes to Berlin, he's in a position to essentially allow the East Germans and Soviets to roll up almost all of the SIS operations in East Germany. He passes on so much information, either photographs or verbal reports to his handlers that I looked at some of the Stasi records in the archives in Berlin, and there's a report that was later done that basically credits Blake with having allowed the destruction of 2 separate British spy rings in East Germany, based on Blake's intelligence. Beyond that, we had a couple, two spies in particular that were hugely important to the CIA. One was Pyotr Popov, who was operating. He was a GRU officer who had approached the Americans in Vienna, and then he'd been transferred eventually to Germany, to East Germany, and Blake was in a position to learn about that, and there's no question that he could have passed on that information. That Popov was discovered, let's see, about a few months after the tunnel ended, and we lost Popov. He was like brought back to Moscow on a pretense, basically, and eventually is tried and executed. And then Penkovsky, I think the case can be made that he's of course the Soviet officer who was operating during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The reason that the KGB was tailing the wife of a MI6 officer in Moscow who was serving as the contact with Penkovsky was because Blake had told them that she was working. That they needed to watch the wife as well. So they had a tail on her. And Hugh Montgomery was obviously involved with the whole Penkovsky case as well. Now, one of the documents I found at the JFK library is a report that Alan Dulles gives to President Kennedy when Blake is arrested in April of 1961. And Dulles talks about the fact that Blake has confessed to having betrayed the tunnel, from the start, which is a complete shock. They just didn't know that. But they also say that, Blake has also provided evidence that leads us to believe that he's responsible for the arrest and execution of a particularly valuable American asset, and that could have been Popov as well. So it's. I think the KGB definitely got its money's worth. I'd say both sides got what they were looking for in a way.
I have a logistics question about putting together, Dave Anhalt right here. I have a logistics question about putting together this type of research. It goes a couple of ways. First of all, the resources that you use to actually have, for instance, the ability to ask a question about what type of great intelligence came from the tunnel. Where does somebody find those footnotes? And then number two, given recent books that are being written and a review has to occur at the National Security Council before release, did you also have to do that sort of review process through some agency in the government before the release of the book?
No. I didn't work for the CIA, so I didn't have to go through the PRB, the Publications Review Board process. So I didn't have that handicap that, say, someone like Bay Stockton, the CIA officer who wrote about Bill Harvey, faced, or anybody else who ever worked for the agency. So from that standpoint, that made things easier. So in terms of the resources. There were, the CIA has declassified a fair amount of the tunnel records over the years. There was a history that was done back in 1967 that they've declassified portions of it progressively more. Actually, they went backwards at one point and reclassified some of the things they declassified. But fortunately, I had like the earlier one. A lot of the British had their own records, particularly in relation to Blake. So at the Imperial War Museum had the records from his trial, for example, and there are also records from the Prime Minister's office that related to the tunnel, and then for Blake's escape and all that, there were lots of reports in the British archives about that. And then no, it wasn't. I mean, that's what a lot of people think, but I've got a chapter on that, and it's pretty clear. It was basically this Keystone Cops operation with fellow prisoners helping him escape, because he had a knack for making friends. It's pretty ironic, but he was not the KGB. Blake had confessed everything when he was arrested, so they didn't have much of a motive to try to spring him or to exchange. So when they made the exchange for Gary Francis Powers, they didn't trade him for Blake. They traded him for Abel, because Abel hadn't spoken, and they also had the Cohens who worked with the Rosen. I mean, so they had other people that were higher up on their list who hadn't spoken, who hadn't confessed. Blake had confessed, so he wasn't. There was, and then the presidential libraries, like the Eisenhower Library and the Kennedy Library, things have gradually been declassified. So some things that I used in the book have only been declassified in the last couple of years. So it's kind of a question of time sometimes to find these things.
Other questions? Anybody?
You're comparing this to things that would happen in the future with Gary Powers and you two, and I'm just curious, I'm looking at the map that you showed, and obviously need to read the book to get further details, but what was the cover story going to be when, I don't know specifically, it looked like that equipment was on the east side.
Yeah.
They would be located physically on the east side, and if somebody had started digging and prevented them from running back through the tunnel back to the warehouse, they're not doing research on atmospheric science projects. What would be the story that you could give, and what would happen from your perspective, obviously speculation, if they were caught? Would they be sitting in jail, or would they have a worse outcome in regards to the situation at that time in the 50s?
Well, for the tunnel operation, the general rule was, unless you had a reason to be down the tunnel in the equipment room, you didn't go. So they kept most of the operation back in the warehouse, partly for that reason. They put in these steel doors, with sophisticated locks, to block the entrance into the equipment chamber, at both ends, so they could lock those down. They'd also Harvey had lined the entire route of the tunnel with C5 explosive, so he could blow the whole thing, and he wanted to. And that was something that Hugh Montgomery was given the task of going to find the commanding general of the Berlin Command the night and morning that the tunnel was discovered, and Harvey wanted permission to blow the tunnel, and General Dasher, the commander, they found him on the golf course at the Wannsee Yacht Club, and he was like, "You want to blow the tunnel? That's going to start World War III." And so he didn't. Harvey was really disappointed, but they went down there with a 50 cal machine gun, and they put it down at the American end. They also had some barbed wire they'd strung up. They also put like a sign saying that you are now entering the American sector, right? It's kind of a way to thumb their nose. So it was kind of this coy thing. They didn't think that the Soviets would say anything about the tunnel. They thought they're going to be so embarrassed by this that they're going to keep it quiet. I mean, that's what Harvey had predicted. So they were shocked when they brought the press out to look at everything. They didn't realize that this whole propaganda coup that the Soviets were hoping to make. So yeah, and the equipment was lost, basically. They didn't have time to get that out. But while it was, the amplifiers, that wasn't, it was it was the latest stuff, but it wasn't super sophisticated advertising or anything like that. So the really more sophisticated stuff was back in the warehouse. Yes, so the tunnel was, this is when the West German, or not the West Germans, at this point, this is after the wall comes down. They end up building an Autobahn that right along pretty much where the wall was, along that section that goes out to the Schönefeldt Airport. So this was the section of the tunnel that was uncovered, while the workers were digging the Autobahn tunnel. The other thing that's kind of cool is all the tunnel, most of the tunnel was on the eastern side. This is a piece that was on the western side. On the eastern side, the Soviets and East Germans, they kept the tunnel open for 9 months. They opened it up for tours. It became like the biggest tourist draw. They had 40,000 tourists coming through the tunnel. They wanted to like show how evil the Americans were and all this, and it was like a big tourist draw. They had beer and sausage stand there, and you could use the binoculars and look around. But there was the East Germans, after 9 months, they got tired of all that, and they dug up the tunnel. They destroyed the orchard in the process, but they cut up the tunnel pieces into like 10-meter sections, and they shipped them out to East German army units around the country to use for training, because this is really good steel. They could use them for like command posts during for training exercises. Some of them ended up being used for storage. Eventually, like some farmers got a hold of some sections. They used them as silos to store feed. So a few of these sections have been found in recent years, and one of the sections has just ended up recently at the International Spy Museum in DC. So if you go down to the Spy Museum there, they have like an authentic section of the East German. I met the East German. He was a retiree who was out in the woods and actually found that piece of section about 5 or 6 years ago. And there's some other, a few other sections that they found in recent years as well. I would suggest getting one here, except it would be bigger than the building, unfortunately.
Anybody else?
So it goes pretty well with where you were going. Just curious what happened to the farm and the warehouse. What do they look like today?
Yeah. Well, I went over the land. I mean, you got the Autobahn section, sort of running perpendicular to where the spy tunnel went. On the eastern side, it looks somewhat like it used to, in that it's kind of an open field. You don't have the orchard anymore, except that when I was walking around with the farmer's daughter, we found one last pear tree from the old days. It's kind of a park there. Now on the western side, where the warehouse was, it basically sat there, and I think there was a gentleman I was speaking to earlier who was stationed in Berlin. It was still there into the 80s. The U.S. used it as an army installation. The radar station actually operated for quite a while after the tunnel was discovered, because they were actually getting good signal intelligence from that station. But eventually, the warehouse, that land was given back to the farmer whom they rented that land from, and the warehouse fell into disrepair because nobody wanted to pay to keep it up. And it was eventually torn down. They've built now all these little summer cottages where you have like about 40 different German families have these tiny little plots of land with all these cottages with red tiles crammed up right next to each other with little gardens. You can you can drive around there, and it has names like Mozartstrasse and so forth. So yeah. And the
Anybody
Bauhaus
else?
Museum in Berlin has a section of the tunnel. And they do have at the site of right where the tunnel actually was, they do have some signs, information signs that the city of Berlin has put up describing the tunnel operation.
Other questions? Let's thank Steve for a great presentation.